On a local level, politically, you have chiefs, men who serve in what the terminology is sort of traditional African society, but it's been adjusted to a modern bureaucratic governmental structure. They handle a number of local matters, but it's tied into the national government in various ways. And so then there are provinces. Our area was known as Central Province, and Central Province has members of parliament that represent them. That goes on up to the national level where you have parliament, and then you have the president. Although the president wielded a great deal of power and a lot of the agencies and governmental machinery was really under his control and authority, especially then.
Would you describe it as a democracy?
At that time, it was a sort of democracy. Democracies, it's really, you have to look at these types of political systems on a spectrum. So the people voted for officials, for members of parliament, and they voted for the president. And so at that point it looks and seems sort of like a democracy. However, there was, at the time we were there, only one political party, and they controlled who would be running for office. The judiciary was not really independent, and so the judiciary often was tied into the ruling political party and the presidency and ruled with that. And an independent judiciary is very critical for a democracy. There was a press, but the press was limited in what it could say. It could launch certain kinds of criticisms, but it could only go so far before they would get into trouble. So there were some early nascent forms of democracy, but there were still great limitations on what could be done. That's all right. There were factions in Kenya. And the factions are based on people groups or ethnic groups. Kenya is made up of, depending on how you count, 50 to 70 different people groups. I mean, some are very similar and have very similar languages, so it depends on how you break it down. Different ethnic groups, different languages, and that is the strongest sense of identity that most Kenyans feel. That identity to their ethnic group oftentimes trumps the national identity. And so what happened politically is that people would tend to identify with a candidate who belonged to their particular ethnic group. In our region, it was Kikuyu, which was the largest ethnic group in Kenya. But even the largest ethnic group was only 22%. So
there's so many more.
There's so many more vying for power, and so that made politics a matter of forming all these different alliances with different factions representing different people groups. And that was one of the arguments at the time for having only one political party. Because the argument was if you had multiple political parties, it would fracture and divide up into party lines along these different ethnic groups. What did happen in voting is, now on the provincial level with the MP, this wasn't a problem because the people who ran were, it's Central Province, the people who ran were Kikuyu, most of the people who voted were Kikuyu, that worked out. But on a national level, you certainly supported and voted for somebody who belonged to your own ethnic group. Yeah, it was a bit wild. I mean, we're visitors, and so of course we didn't vote, we didn't go to the polls. But in 1992, they had an election for president, and there had been great pressure to open up the system to allow alternative parties, multiple parties. And there was great resistance by the ruling party, KANU, to do that. Actually, the reason why there was great pressure to do that, strangely enough, was because the Cold War had ended. Kenya had always been an ally of the United States. It was, in East Africa, the most economically prosperous country and one that was most closely allied to the United States. And as long as the Cold War was going on, the United States did not push Kenya very much because they needed them as an ally. Once the Cold War ended in 1989, there's no longer sort of the same threat that Kenya might, suddenly go over to the communists or anything like that. And so United States, but also other countries, Great Britain especially has a very close relationship, put pressure on for multiple parties. Some Kenyans put on pressure for multiple parties. Well, there was great resistance from the government. KANU had a president from the Kalenjin people, Daniel Arap Moi at the time, and there was great resistance to this. So that built up a lot of tension within the country, and in the midst of the negotiations and sort of the maneuvering around for that, there were a few moments that got. Periodically, you would have riots in Nairobi, oftentimes at the university, because college students tend to get a little, a little rambunctious sometimes, but they were politically charged. But I remember one day in particular when the anger and the tension broke out in our area. We had main road from our town into Nairobi, which was about an hour, and we were told not to go into Nairobi, just stay where we were, because along that road violence could break out. And indeed, they were pulling people out of cars and beating them up if they belonged to it. And the word was, they had some people, some Kikuyu thugs, if you will, or people who had pulled out, and had killed one guy who was Kalenjin and so forth. So we were a little, worried about what is going to happen here. Is everything going to fall apart? Is this system going to collapse under these tensions? And it was a little rugged, but they made it through.